This morning's reading out of the Wednesday night study. So we were in Exodus. We did chapters 1 and 2, and we were dealing with this new character that we were introduced to, Moses. And most of us know the story about Moses in that there was a plot by the king at the time to get rid of the Jewish boys, and he had decreed that anybody finding a Jewish male could just toss him in the river, and we'll get rid of the Jewish nation because he thought they were posing a threat. So this little guy Moses, he's born, and his mother takes him and sticks him in a little basket, hides him in the river. Pharaoh's daughter comes down, finds him. She calls him Moses because Moses literally means drew out. That's what the Hebrew word means, drew out. So she calls him. So in reality, his name is Drew, not Moses, but. So she gets a hold of him, and Moses then is brought up and adopted into the Pharaoh, the king's house, and then for the next 40 years, and this is kind of what we miss when we're going through the story, okay? We miss the time frames that are going on. So now for the next 40 years, Moses lives in Pharaoh's palace. Now think about this. Moses, in living in Pharaoh's palace, there's the Pharaoh has a son, and then there's Moses. So Moses is actually in line. He could be the next Pharaoh. If something happens to the son, Moses would be the next in line because he's an adopted son. So Moses, while he's there, he's schooled, he's taught everything. Okay, they would teach them about arts. They would teach them about cultural things. They would teach them about how to run a country. They would train them up in fighting skills militarily, how to lead an army, how to actually physically fight yourself, how to rule and reign as a king or as a pharaoh. So this is his lifestyle. He lives in a palace. He's waited on hand and foot. Okay, so that's for the first 40 years. Then he goes outside one day, and remember, he is a Hebrew, and when he walks outside the one day, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating up a Hebrew slave, and it says there that he walked up and he looked left and looked right, kind of thing, and he took matters into his own hands. He beats the Egyptian taskmaster and kills him. So he takes him and buries him in the sand. Next morning there's two other Hebrews fighting amongst each other. He steps in, and again these two guys say, so now you're going to judge us? What, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Word got out. The problem was that if he killed an Egyptian, the law stated that he had to be put to death. So Pharaoh, now his stepdad, had to put him to death, or otherwise he'd lose face in the nation. So he decides to run. At 40 years old, he runs. And it says to us that he ran away, and he runs out into the desert area. And he gets out to a place, and it says in verse 15 of chapter 2, it says there, and he got to a place and he sat down by a well. The well is always a picture of and talks of Jesus, the water. Okay, that's what it's symbolic of. So at this point he's running, and he gets to a place where he sits down. What are you running from today? Give that a thought. What are you running from today? What is the thing that in your life it's just like, we spoke about it last week, just thorn in the flesh, just something that gnaws at you, that you wish there was a habit that you could change, there's just something. What are you running from? At this point he sits down, and at this point when he sits down, now God takes over, big time. I'm not saying God hadn't taken over already and God was in charge of everything, but at this time point from here on out, you just see a massive change in this man's life, right? And the first thing that happens is these 7 shepherdesses come up, and he has an encounter with these shepherdesses, right? And interesting, because we read in Genesis that when Joseph's brothers come down and his fathers come down to the land of Egypt, he says to them, hey, when the Pharaoh asks you, what do? Tell them you are shepherds, because a shepherd is an abomination. The Egyptians look down on shepherds totally. Interesting. This guy runs, gets to the well, sits down. I've now run far enough, because he sat down, right? Something within him's determined, I've run far enough. and he sits down. You and I need to get to a point in our own walk with God where I've run far enough. I've run away from myself. I've run away from, when you're putting on a false front, and in essence, you're not facing up to the truth of who you are or what you are, and you're running. Here he gets to this point where he runs far enough, and what does God do? He brings in 7 abominations. That's what they are. They're shepherdesses, right? They're abominations, 7 of them, perfect number. And he brings them in, and it says now that in verse 21, it says here, this is where we're going to take our reading from this morning. So in Exodus chapter 2, verse 21, it says, Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses. And she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land, or I've been a stranger in a strange land. If I said to you today, let's go find it, and I got up and I just started walking around looking, you guys are going to say to me, find what? What are we looking for, right? It's interesting to me how many of us go through life not knowing what we're actually looking for. And when you break it down and you look at people, I don't care what religion they're in, it always comes down to 1 or 2 things. And mostly it comes down to peace. This thing called shalom. It's just having a peace. You're not running anymore. You have a peace with you and God. You have a peace with your fellow man. Everybody wants a measure of this thing called peace. And that's what the Bible promises us, okay? I mean, Jesus is called the Prince of Peace. That's one of his names, Prince of Shalom, Salem. And there's this peace thing that we're searching for. Yet, if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you even going to find it? I mean, it was Forrest Gump who coined that life is like a box of chocolates. Okay? And you just don't know what you're going to get, right? I'd suggest to you, for me, looking around here and my little warped drawing kind of little mind that I have, for me, life is more like a bowl of beans. And I mean, for those of you that have been around, like when Erica's made her beans, man, everybody likes those beans. And not all beans are created equal. I mean, sometimes you're going to have beans, and man, those beans are good now, but there's an aftermath. And I mean, the other day I went, we were somewhere, and there was a pot of beans there, and luckily I heard the lady say, those ones, they got chili in them. And I stayed away from those beans. I didn't even want to go near those beans. You know, and so for some people love those chili beans. Other people, like me, we just can't stand them. But that's typically how life is. And you can basically break down beans into 3 different types of beans. First one is just the regular bean. It's the bean that is now present. And that bean that is present just lives life for the present, for the here, the now. And that mentality, for today we live, or today we drink, for tomorrow we die. It's an Epicurean belief system. That belief system was around centuries ago. And that's what that comes from, is the Epicureans, this group of people that believed this, their train of thought was, there is no hereafter, there's only today. So if there's no heaven, there's obviously no hell, so therefore there's no repercussion. So therefore, live life to the fullest. Now, if there's no repercussion, I can live and do anything that I want to, so long as I'm draining every last ounce of life out of life itself. And that was what the Epicureans believed. So they lived to the fullest. But here's the thing. Growing up, my philosophy was, and sometimes still is, I hate to admit it, but too much of a good thing is wonderful. That often was my philosophy. But here's the thing. That's not so. How about too many drinks? Alcohol poisoning. Too many drugs? Overdose. Too many affairs? Death.
Too much food.
Too much food. Tell me about it. But all these things, if there's no God, they're not really sinful. So therefore, you can just indulge. But here's the thing. Really and truly, if you break them down, they do end up being sin. And the wages of sin is death. You take anything and do it to the fullest, the extreme, it's going to kill you. Okay? So the Epicurean belief, this little epi-being, if you want to call it that, that's not the right way to go. The other type of being then is the has-been. The has-been is the individual that, man, you're getting older in life and it's always the good old days. Even though you walk through 5 foot of snow, uphill both ways, to school kind of thing, that's still the good old days. And in your mind, as you've gotten older, even though you sat on the bench for the football team, in your mind, as you've gotten old and all the witnesses have died off, you are now the star quarterback and everything becomes better and grows, And life will never ever get better than what it has been. So you want to live in the has-been mentality. So too with the Christian. The Christian, living as a has-been, recalls and recounts, oh man, when I was first saved, I was so on fire. Man, I saved up and I bought a ticket and I flew to Africa and I went and fed some. Well, what about today? What are you doing today? Don't live in the has-been mentality. Then there's the other being, the last one, that's the wanna-being. That's somebody living for the future. And we've spoken about that many times. Wanna-being is the person that's, I'm saved, no matter how good life is, no matter what I've been given, no matter what I've been blessed with, I'm just waiting to die so that I can get into heaven, where the streets are gold, there's not going to be another tear, not going to be pain, not going to be sorrow. Well, what about today? So you've got these 3 different stages, and it's almost like we're back on that pendulum that we keep on going to, and you've got these extremes. And in this case, you've got person living in the past, the person living for the future, and the person that's living for the joys of life right now. But all 3 are wrong. So what now? Here's what I'd suggest to you is the key. Is this little verse here. Then Moses was content. Are you content today? Are you content with your health, your financial situation? Your marriage, your kids, your job? Are you content? I guarantee you, if you sit down and analyze it for long enough, you'll find a place in your life that you're not content, because that's human nature. Okay? But it says here Moses was content. Now, if the Bible tells me that Moses was content, it means that Moses was content. But Moses, we just explained, Moses came out of the palace. He had everything. He was weighted on hand and foot. Now he's fleeing, and he's now got to go and live in a household with 7 abominations, 7 shepherdesses. I'm not going to ask the guys this question because I don't want anybody I don't want to do a funeral service, but I'll ask the ladies. How many ladies here would like to go and live in a household with 7 other women? Yet Moses was content. So the Bible says he was content, it must be true. So what's going on here? How did he manage to be content in this situation? Not only were these 7 women, the woman that he marries, here, she is the daughter of a Midianite priest. He's a Hebrew. Obviously his roots and his hearts are still with the Hebrew nation, because he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and he murdered the Egyptian. He took the Hebrew side. When he addresses those 2 Hebrews that are fighting, he talks about his brothers. So he's still in touch with his roots. He's still in touch with, I'm a Hebrew, I'm governed by God. But now he's marrying a Satanist's daughter, put it that way. I can't think of a stronger way to put it. So here's a good Christian boy going to marry a Satanist daughter. And he's content. He's running away because he committed murder, but he's content. And then he has this child, and he turns around and he says, I have been a stranger, and it's actually in a strange land. The better translation for that, because of the root words, I am an alien in I am a sojourner. Okay, I'm just a traveler. And then the second strange land or foreign land is in an alien land or in an adulterous land. Okay? So he's identifying and he's saying, I'm not part of this world. Jump with me quickly to, I hope I had it written down. Yeah. That's what I wanted to say. By the way, verse 21, then Moses was content. Guess what the Jewish word for content is? Yal. I love that when I saw that. The Hebrew word is Y-A-A-L. And it's the pronunciation, because this thing that I've got breaks that gives you the phonetic. It's Y-A space A-A-L. I mean A-L-L. Y'all. I love that. Excuse my pronunciation. So there you go. You won't forget the Hebrew word for content. So turn with me quickly to book of Philippians, chapter 4:11. Ephesians, Philippians. Now, we may say, okay, fair enough.
Philippians 4:11.
Chapter 4, verse 11. Now, we can say about Moses, but hold on a second. He could be content because, he's had a sit-down session at the well, and man, he's Moses. God's going to part the Red Sea for him, and he's Moses. He's going to be able to raise his hands, and wars are going to go on, and they're going to win, and he's Moses. He's the guy that went and got the 10 Commandments directly from God. Yada, yada, yada. But here's the thing. Moses is still a man. Okay, Moses has got a lot to moan about right now. Moses literally could be sitting in the back end of the desert saying, man, I'm a prince. And I'm sitting in the back end of a desert, and now I'm the lowest of low with the sheep and the goats and everything else. And he could bemoan his situation. But it turns around and says, Moses was content. Here's another man that I want to go and look at his story here. And this man that we're talking about is Paul. And Paul, just a quick background on Paul. Paul's physical description that you get, this is in secular writings, tells us that he was a short man. He was hunched over. His legs were bowed out. And he walked with difficulty. He had a very bent, broken nose. He obviously had one of those big old Jewish noses and been bent a couple of times and broken up. And he had poor eyesight. Now, that's just what they mentioned. They didn't mention the fact that, in this description, that he was stoned to death 3 times. He had rocks dropped on him 3 times. There must have been some physical, deformities just from that alone. He was shipwrecked twice. He was bitten by an adder on an island where those adders kill you. There's no coming back from that, and he survived. This man, it would be like getting hit by an 18-wheeler a couple of times across, with the main road. This is Paul's life. And yet, look what Paul says here in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. It says, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. You see, Paul says, I have learned. He didn't say, I prayed to God for contentment, and God gave me the gift of contentment. It's not a gift of contentment. There isn't a gift of contentment. He also didn't say, he also didn't pray that God would take away all the things that are bugging him, and therefore I can be content. He didn't pray that his needs were going to be met. You see this word here where it says, in verse 11, it says, not that I speak in regard to need. That need, for me, I read it as, I need something in order to survive. This guy's got a serious something lacking in his life. It's a need that's lacking in his life. That's not what the word is. I wrote it down. The Greek on that is hysteriosin. And it means a temporary need. It doesn't speak of poverty. It's a temporary need. That's what Paul did. He learned something. These needs are temporary. Doesn't the Bible tell us that God will meet all my needs? So if I'm going without now, and I stand on this word and God's promise, and God says, I will provide for you, I'll meet all your needs. So therefore, if I'm in need of something right now, and God's word tells me that He is going to provide, is that need not a temporary thing? That's what Paul learned. These needs that I'm going without, they are temporary. They are temporary. So, just as Paul says here, I have learned to be content. Just as a side note, I want to jump back into this. Go into chapter 4, verse 8, also in Philippians. And this is Paul giving a summation of what he's writing to these Philippians. And he says here, finally, brethren, I like the way when Paul says finally. He's definitely a pastor, because Paul says finally, and then you turn the pages a couple of times, he's still going, okay? His finally is not finally, but he says here, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if anything there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. That word meditate over there is taken from a cow chewing on the cud. And out here, most of you know, with a cow's got a number of stomachs, and what it'll do is it'll go, oh, here's a nice patch of grass, and it'll eat that patch of grass. It goes into the first stomach, and he'll eat and eat and eat, and then he'll take a walk, and then later on you will see the cow literally, he'll barf it back up out of the first stomach, and he'll chew it up more, and then it'll go down and it'll go into the next stomach and the next stomach, and this process is repeated over and over and over again. That's what this word here, meditate, means. It doesn't mean sit in the lotus position and it means take this word that you've heard and chew on it. And it's interesting, because as you go through your life, today you're having a good day, and I can read something to you out of the Bible, or you can read something in your morning devotion, and you're having a good day. Oh, that's nice. Tomorrow you get some terrible news, and whatever it is, you go to the doctor, and all of a sudden the doctor says, you know what, you got cancer. Now all of a sudden that same verse comes back in a whole different way, and now you chew on it in a different way. That's what this Bible, what it says here about meditate. Chew on it as you go through different days, different life experiences. Chew on the same word over and over and over again. The word is not just I read it, I've got that done, and now I move on to my next thing. If you sit and you spend approximately, I think it's 11 or 12 minutes a day reading aloud, you will read through this entire Bible in 70 hours. So just reading through this is not where it's at. If God meant this thing to just take 70 hours and you toss it out and get another book, that's not what it's all about. It's meditate, it's chew on. Here's what He's telling you to chew on. And if you find yourself in a place of discontentment, this is what Paul is talking about. If you find yourself in a place of anxiety over something that's coming up, if you find yourself in a place of depression, despair, whatever it is, this is your key right here. It's on these things that you should meditate. Whatever things are true, I'd say that's here in the word. Whatever things are noble, there's a lot of admonition as far as living a noble life. Whatever things are just. Man, we spoke about justice this morning, big time in Sunday school. Whatever things are pure, are lovely, of good report, and if there is any virtue, and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. And then he turns around and he says later on, for I have learned to be content. And he says here, in whatever state. Interesting that he says, in whatever state that he finds himself in. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9:13. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Verse, where were we? Yeah, 13. Yeah, we'll start there. Now, we're having a look at Paul and kind of piecing together why he's saying and how he's learned the state of contentment. We've seen physically he got a bit of a rough deal, okay? Now, Paul now is full-time in the ministry. If ever there was anybody that's full-time in the ministry, it's going to be Paul. I mean, you look at his missionary journeys. I mean, here's the thing. Back in the day, I understand that a journey from here to Uvalde would take 3 days by horse. Paul, I mean, you look at his journeys. I mean, his whole life, he was journeying and then getting to a place and ministering and then getting stoned, not in a Campwood way, but in a bad Jewish way. And then, you know, his life wasn't easy at all. And then, but he says here in verse 13, now remember, he is a full-time pastor. He says, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple? So in the old system, and what was going on right there, is the people's tithes. If they bring in a sacrifice, right, that goat, sheep, whatever, would get sacrificed. Certain portions would be offered to the Lord. Other portions would be for the priests to eat from. Same with the table of showbread. The priests would eat of that bread. Okay, so Paul's saying, don't you know that the priests get to eat from the stuff that comes in the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar, what have we just spoken about, verse 14. Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. So those that are full-time pastors should be getting paid and living from what they're getting. Okay, that's what Paul's saying. Verse 15, I've got this, in my Bible when things are orange, this is like, hey, this is for me personally. And he says, yeah, but I have used none of these things. Paul's saying to this church at Corinth, because the church at Corinth were one of the churches that had it upon their hearts to actually take up special offerings for other churches, make sure that their pastors were getting paid and all that kind of thing. Paul says to these guys, he says, I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done for me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. Paul's boasting is, look how God has taken care of me. My God will meet all my needs. Okay? When he got stoned and he was left for dead, came back to life. When he was shipwrecked, he was saved. When he was bitten, he came through. That's his physical needs. But what about now? He's talking about food. My very food. God says to us, Jesus actually said it, he says, why do you guys worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear, your clothes? He said, because God has taken care of the birds. Look how the birds are clothed. I mean, you look at birds. I mean, that was one of my hobbies, was bird photography when I was back in South Africa. And you're just amazed at how God can mix colors. You look at the colors on a bird and get dressed in those same color schemes, you look hideous. I mean, but yet God can mix them in such a way that they are just perfect combinations. And here Jesus says, you guys worry about what you wear? Look how God clothes the birds. So they don't worry about what they're going to eat, and God provides. In fact, it's a verse that says that God has never seen any of his kids go hungry and begging for bread. Well, hold on a second. Does that mean all Christians don't have to worry about food? No, that's not what it's saying. But it is saying that you're not going to die from it. But in going through that hardship, there's oftentimes a lesson in it. Anybody that has gone through a hardship, anybody that's gone through having to skip meals, not because they want to, but because they have to. Anybody that's been on like the ramen 2-minute noodle diet for a couple of weeks out of necessity knows the meaning of what it's like to have. Also knows the meaning and what it's like to be able to share with somebody that doesn't have. It puts you in touch with things. So oftentimes those hardships that we go through is preparing you to now go and minister. Interesting. Look at the character we started with, Moses. Moses, just like Paul, because Paul was raised up in the whole Jewish synagogue thing, if you want to call it that. Paul studied under the most knowledgeable and the leading rabbi of the time, Gamaliel. And Paul got to a point where he superseded this guy's knowledge. So Paul was raised up. He was ready to step into become one of these big priests and everything, right? And what happened? God took Paul and stuck him in a desert. And Paul went and stayed in a desert roughly about 10 years or so, that time period. Paul went and got stuck into the desert. Why? So that he could be untaught. There's a word for my linguistic friend. So God could unteach him. Same with Moses. Moses, he was so educated. Now God had to take him and stick him in the desert and unlearn him and relearn him in the sense of, you know what? You're going to be a shepherd. You need to learn how to shepherd. You need to learn what it's like to be a shepherd. And so often with us, you go through a hardship in life and you'll sit down and you'll say, Lord, please take this away from me. Instead of take this away from me, Lord, what are you teaching me? And in learning and getting educated on whatever he's teaching you, you're now getting a skill set that you can take into your next step and use that. Here's the thing. Moses was now in the desert for 40 years. We read the story of Moses, and Moses, he was in the bulrushes in his little boat, and then he went into the palace, and then he ran away from the palace, and then he went back to the palace and did the miracles, and then he led the people out, and then he died. And in our mindsets, it's a boom, 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 boom. Well, here's the thing. 40 years, Moses is in the palace. 40 years, Moses is in the desert. And then the next 40 years, he's leading the people through the desert. Now, after 40 years, you think, Moses, wow, 40 years of education, he's going to be perfect, right? Moses messed it up as royally as anybody. That gives me hope. And Moses was still used mightily, regardless of his flaws and regardless of his failures. That gives me hope. It's not about me. So here, Paul, in this, what we're reading in Corinthians, he's turning around and he's saying, I'm not going to take the wage that the church should be paying me because I do not want to lose anything of my boasting. I don't want to lose what God has done in my life. I want to be able to walk in and say, hey, you need to turn to the Lord because here. And not have people say, oh, well, you paid to say that. You're a pastor. And that's why, on one hand, it's a dream come true to be able to start shepherding a church. On the other hand, there's another side to it. Because now all of a sudden, you're part of the pastor clique. Oh, you have to say that you're a pastor. You have to do that because you're a pastor. And trust me, I don't have to do anything. I choose to do stuff. And you rub me the wrong way, you're going to get the Rory side of Rory, not the pastor side of Rory, because there's still my humaneness there. Just because I've chosen to serve God with my life in this way doesn't mean that I'm now a super saint. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Because now I spend, which is a good thing, I spend a lot more time in this. And the more time I spend in this, the more time I realize that it's definitely not super saint. And so too with Moses, and so too with Paul. And then Paul goes on in verse 17, he says, for if I do this willingly, if I spread God's word, if I shepherd, if I do these things willingly without doing it for the paycheck, says, I have a reward. And then he goes on and he says, that when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge. I'm not going to charge for it. That I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. Paul wants his witness to be pure. Interesting in that if you start reading between the lines in that, it starts letting you know, hey, Did Paul always have a 3-course meal every night that he sat down? Oftentimes not. Did Paul have everything as far as his physical needs? No. Paul talks about it and he says, I prayed 3 different times for healing. Paul, on one of his trips, there's a lot of additional writings that you can read up on this, okay? And Paul talks about it in the Bible. He says, I've got a thorn in my flesh, and God has chosen to leave that thorn in my flesh, and it's to humble me. What happened was Paul, when on one of his missionary journeys, he was going inland, and it is believed, and there's a lot of evidence to back this train of thought, that Paul contracted a tropical disease that affected his eyes. And Paul says, I prayed to the Lord 3 times for him to remove this, and God answered him. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you. That learning contentment, what you're going through, your hardships that you're going through, are there for 2 reasons. One, as I said, is to equip you to go forth and do the work. But on the other side of it, it's for a personal aspect as well. And that is, it's in those times that you learn to rely on God. Where God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul had to go on the last of his missionary journeys. He had to recruit Luke to come with him, Dr. Luke, so Luke could take care of him. Paul couldn't even write a lot of the last of his writings because he couldn't see. He had to get other people to actually do the writing for him. And here's this man who studied all his life and with all these scriptures and everything, and here he's now being struck with this disease. Why would Paul get struck with that disease? I mean, it doesn't make sense. But God works in very different ways. And he says, my ways are not your ways. So when you're going through these hardships, it's twofold. Lord, what are you preparing me for? Lord, what are you saying to me personally? What do I need to sit down at the well for? What do I need to stop running from? What's in it for me? Jump back into where we were, Exodus chapter 2. You see, Paul came to the conclusion and he said, you know what? I've prayed for relief. And the relief that I got was God answered me and said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. And he got that understanding. And when things aren't working out in this strange land that we're in, God's grace was going to be sufficient for him. Moses said here, he was content. Why? He came to this realization. He said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Jesus would say, live in the world, but don't be of the world. You and I are exactly this. We are strangers in a strange land. We are sojourners. Sojourners literally means one that is traveling through. Okay? When you walk around in this town and you see all these trucks coming past, let that be a reminder to you. Let that speak to you about this. In the sense, when that truck comes past, that thing is just traveling through. Boom. That truck coming through here, it really isn't concerned about the city of Campwood. It's not concerned about the restaurants, the shopping malls, the nightlife. It's not concerned about anything like that. All it's concerned about is basically slowing down, obeying the laws.
Not even that.
Well, sometimes, yeah, in order to get through this town and getting out the other end. He's a sojourner, just like you and me. This world that we're in right now, it's not our permanent home. We are a sojourner. We are told, just like Abraham, not to put down and build houses, but to live in tents. It doesn't mean that you literally mustn't go and build a house and you've got to go now live in a tent. It's not talking about that. It's saying, look at it as a temporary thing. In other words, when you view stuff, my house, man, I like my house. I like building my house. But you know what? At the end of the day, that house is going to burn. If not, it's going to be given to some heathen when I'm raptured. So why get so caught up in it? Why get caught up in all these different things here on earth? View it as it's a temporary thing and enjoy what's going on. Enjoy your journey, your time here, and not get so caught up and hung up on all these little things, living up to the Joneses. Why do we get caught up in that? Honestly, I mean, we had the opportunity to buy more land just recently, and it was so funny because Shell and I both came to this conclusion: do we need it? And all of a sudden I realized, you know what? A couple of years we're going to be totally debt free. Wow. I can't even keep up with the little bit that we have. Why do I want more? But yet one thing I do see out here is, and if you happen to have a lot of land, good for you. God's blessed you, great. But I mean, what I do see out here is many people, oh, I've got this ranch, and then I've got that ranch, and I've got that ranch. And one of the guys that I know, he's got a beautiful piece of property. In the last couple of years, I've enjoyed that property more than what he has because he doesn't go onto it. It's too big. And he's got another home here and another home there. But yet when a storm comes, like we've just had, and it washes the water gap out, now all of a sudden he's got to get down and he's really stressed out because my exotic animals are going to get out, and I've got to find somebody who can fix my storm gap. Me, I get home, I look over the fence, oh, my dog's there, good, life's good. You know, when you start looking at it more simplistically, like we are a sojourner, you're a truck barreling through here, makes life a lot more interesting, a lot more enjoyable. The truck driver comes through and he, oh, look at this, look at that, oh, there's Desi's, huh, there's a new church, yeah, and he's through. He just enjoyed the journey. That's you and me. But don't be like those beans, okay, in terms of I'm just living for death. Don't be that. Enjoy what's here, because God says, I've come to give you life and life abundantly. It starts here. But then he goes on and he says, he's in a foreign land. He's in a strange land. This strange land here is alien or adulterous. That's what the Hebrew word breaks down to. It's an adulterous land. And that's what Jesus was saying. Be in the world, but not part of it. This world is a corrupt world. Interesting, because it says there that Satan is the god of this world. Did you catch that? Satan's a god. That's what the Bible says. Now all of a sudden, when you say your prayers and you pray, do you realize God is not his name? God is simply a title. Okay? He is the God. He's the God of gods. But God is a title. That's not his name. In discovering his name, now you'll start building relationship. That is the next key, the next step that this man Moses takes, and that's where we're going to go next week. Really discovering who God is, what is his name. Okay? Let's pray.